Good morning, everybody, or good evening, or good afternoon, or wherever you are. Incredibly lucky to be talking to Bryan Stevenson today. He's one of the most acclaimed civil rights attorneys and social justice activists in America today, if not in the world. He's also one of the most humble and inspiring people I've ever met. And as founder of the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama, Bryan and his brilliant team have won reversals, relief, or release for over 135 wrongly condemned men and women on death row. He has argued and won multiple cases before the US Supreme Court. He's won landmark rulings, and he was appointed to President Obama's task force on the 21st century policing. I nominated Bryan's book, Just Mercy, for my Literati book club, as it is a story of hope, but also a damning indictment of a system marred by error and unimaginable cruelty. The book has deeply touched many of our literati readers by either reinforcing or completely shifting their views of criminal justice. Anyway, welcome, Bryan, and as always, it is a real honor to have you join us today. Thank you.
It's great to be with you, Richard. Really an honor.
Thank you. Well, I think, as you know, I've never held back my own personal thoughts on the death penalty. I think it's barbaric. I think it's inhumane. I think it morally demeans us all. So I just wondered whether we could hit off by you telling us your first death penalty case, which you were involved in, and how maybe that defined your career.
Well, thank you. And yes, I think when we get on the other side of this issue, credit should be given to people like you, Richard, who recognize the barbarity of the death penalty from the very beginning. I've always argued that capital punishment isn't an issue that can be resolved by asking, do people deserve to die for the crimes they've committed? I think the threshold question is, do we deserve to kill with the kind of flawed systems and the kind of inequality we have in the world? And you are among a small group of people who've always recognized that. But we are making progress. And my own journey really began when I was in law school. I was pretty disillusioned. I was a philosophy major in college. I didn't really know what I was going to do. Got to the end of my college career, realized that nobody was going to pay me to philosophize, and started looking for ways to stay in school. And I discovered that to do graduate work, at least in the US, if you wanted to do graduate work in history or English or political science, you needed to know something about history, English, or political science, which was intimidating to me. So that's how I found my way to law school, because you don't really need to know anything to go to law school. And I was pretty disillusioned in my first year because nobody was talking about inequality or racial bias or social justice. And after going to the School of Government for a year and not finding what I was looking for there, I went back to the law school, took a course that required me to spend a month with a human rights organization. So I went to Georgia to work with lawyers who were representing people on death row. And that was my first encounter with the community of the condemned. And I was really moved by the way these lawyers' lives were animated by their work. I felt passion and connection there. And then they asked me to go to death row and meet someone that they hadn't had time to meet and just explain to him that he wasn't at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And I was pretty intimidated by that. I was a little nervous and felt unprepared, but I said, of course. And I got in my car the next day and I drove down to Jackson, Georgia, where death row is. And I went inside the prison, first time I'd ever been in a state prison like that, never been to death row. They took me back to the visitation room. And I got pretty overwhelmed. I was just super nervous and I felt unqualified. I tried to rehearse exactly what I was going to say to this man when he came in. And then they brought this condemned man, the first condemned person I'd ever seen. And what I remember about him is how burdened with chains he was. He had handcuffs on his wrists. He had a chain around his waist. He had shackles on his ankles. And it took them 10 minutes to unchain him. When they finally had him unchained, I went over and I said, I'm so sorry. I'm just a law student. I don't know much about the death penalty. I don't know much about appellate procedure or criminal procedure or civil procedure. I said, but they sent me down to tell you that you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And I will never forget that man saying, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And he said, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And that man grabbed my hands and he said, thank you, thank you, thank you. He said, you're the first person I've met in the 2 years I've been on death row who's not a death row prisoner or a death row guard. He said, I've been talking to my wife and kids on the phone, but I haven't let them come and visit because I was afraid they'd show up and I'd have an execution date. And I didn't want them to have to deal with that. He said, now because of you, I'm going to see my wife. I'm going to see my kids. He said, thank you, thank you, thank you. And I couldn't believe how even in my ignorance, being proximate, being present with the condemned could have an impact on the quality of someone's life. And we started talking and it turned out we were exactly the same age. We had the same birth date, same month, same day, same year. And he started asking me questions about my life. I asked him questions about his life. And even though I'd only scheduled to be there an hour, we just kept talking. And so 1 hour turned into 2 hours, 2 hours turned into 3 hours. And I write in my book what happened after that. We were talking so long that the guards waiting outside got angry. And they came bursting into the room after 3 hours and they were frustrated and they couldn't do anything to me. So they took it out on this condemned man and they threw him against the wall and they pulled his arms back and they put the handcuffs on his wrist and they put the chain around his waist and they were treating him so violently. And I begged them to be gentler, but they ignored me. They put the shackles back on his ankles and they started shoving him toward the door. And I kept saying, please, it's not his fault. It's my fault. I stayed too long, but they ignored me. And they got that man over to the door. And I remember him planting his feet when he got near the door. And when they tried to shove him through the door, he didn't move. And that's when this man turned to me and he said, Bryan, don't worry about this. You just come back. And then he did something I've never forgotten. He threw his head back, he closed his eyes, and he started to sing. And he started to sing this hymn. He said, I'm pressing on the upward way. New heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I'm onward bound. And then he said, Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. And everybody stopped and the guards recovered and they started pushing him down the hallway and you could hear the chains clanging. But you could also hear this condemned man singing about higher ground. And when I heard that man sing, that's when everything changed for me. That's when I knew I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. And I knew that my journey to higher ground was tied to his journey. I realized that if he doesn't get there, I can't get there. And I went back to Harvard Law School completely transformed. You couldn't get me out of the law school library. I needed to know everything about the jurisprudence necessary to help condemned people get to higher ground. And that's why I tell people today that when they ask me, you know, how I've made a difference, if I've made a difference, and I actually believe if I've helped anybody during my legal career, if I've helped people who were wrongly convicted or unfairly sentenced, if I've made any change, it's not because I'm hardworking or smart or anything like that. It's because I got close to a human being who had been condemned and heard him sing about higher ground. And that made clear for me the dignity and the humanity of every living person and why it is so necessary to abolish the death penalty.
Yeah, and I suspect you've helped people who are rightfully committed as well, not just people who are wrongly committed, because that's another.
Absolutely, absolutely. I just believe each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. I don't believe that any human being is just their worst act.
Mm-hmm.
Someone tells a lie, they're not just a liar. Someone takes something, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill someone, you're not just a killer. And because of that, we have to find the other things you are. I don't think the death penalty is ever appropriate, not just because it is, in my judgment, morally flawed, but I don't think there's a system in the world that can impose perfect punishment in the way that the death penalty requires. It requires perfection, and we don't have that. And it's arrogant for us to assume we could ever achieve that.
Yeah. And obviously there's the racist then element as well, which you've come across many times. And you've actually come, I think your great grandparents were slaves. I think you went to a segregated primary school. I mean, how do you think your family history has impacted your decision to become a lawyer, and did that also trigger your interest in human rights, do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think it absolutely did. And you're absolutely right. My great-grandfather was enslaved in Virginia, in Caroline County, Virginia. He learned to read while enslaved, and that desire for freedom shaped his life. My grandparents fled the American South during the era of terrorism and lynching. My parents grew up in Jim Crow, and they'd see those signs that say white and colored, and people don't realize those signs weren't directions, they were assaults. They created real injuries. I was born in a community where Black children were not allowed to go to the public schools. I started my education in a colored school. There were no high schools for Black kids in the county when my dad was a teenager, so he couldn't go to high school in our county. And I think that weight, the burden, the presumption of dangerousness and guilt that got assigned to Black children at birth definitely weighed on me and weighed on us. And I remember when lawyers came into our community to enforce the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education, which required equal access to public education and made that school district open up their doors to kids like me. And I was really impressed with that power, because if you had a vote, the county was only 25% Black. The majority of white people would have voted to maintain racial segregation. And yet these lawyers had the power to force them to open up the doors. And I think that inspired me. And when I graduated from high school, I went to college and then ultimately went to law school because I wanted to use that same power on behalf of disfavored people. And it did kind of sensitize me to the importance of human rights. There are often going to be times where the majority of people in the society will not protect the vulnerable, will not protect the disfavored, will not protect ethnic minorities or indigenous people. And you have to have the rule of law in place and enforced to protect the rights of the minority. And that's why I believe so strongly that we have to have a strong rights framework. But for a commitment to the rule of law, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you today. But for a commitment to the rule of law and basic human rights, we would not have seen the progress we've seen in protecting children from excessive punishment, protecting some of our clients on death row. And so, yes, that kind of personal experience with being marginalized and excluded very much shaped my worldview on the importance of human rights work, but also inspired me to realize that when people fight, when they push, they can actually do things that other people think may not be achievable.
Yeah, I had. I'm old enough to remember going to South Africa, going in Joburg Airport, seeing the white only toilets and the Black only toilets or blacks and others. I think I can't remember what word used, but and then the beaches, white beaches, black beaches. I mean, it was anyway just a small taste of what your ancestors and us and to a lot of your fellow human beings that had been subjected to in America. We have Literati. They have people send in questions, and so if I move my eyes on occasions, it's to get one of their questions. This is by a woman, a lovely name, Woman Heart. And she asks you, it looks like Virginia is on the verge of abolishing the death penalty. Are there trends in criminal justice at the state level that encourage you?
Yeah, I think it is very exciting that Virginia is poised to become the first Southern state to abolish the death penalty. Since the organization of this country, Virginia has executed more people than any other state. And so this is a really important milestone. And it does reflect some very positive trends at the policy level. We've now seen several states abolish the death penalty in the last several years. On the West Coast, Colorado and New Mexico, and on the East, New York and Connecticut, a lot of states have moved in this direction. The death sentencing rates are down dramatically in the last few years, and that's an encouraging trend. The execution rates are down as well. So I think all of that suggests that there is a growing consciousness that we cannot continue to engage in the folly and the brutality of executing human beings who are not a threat. They are not in any way compromising public safety. But we have some new challenges as well. We have a US Supreme Court now that is not as committed to protecting the rights of people who are on death row, and we've seen that play out recently. But generally speaking, I think, yes, there's a great deal more attention being given to the problems of our legal system, our criminal legal system, great deal more attention to the plight of wrongly convicted and condemned prisoners than there was when you and I first met, a decade ago. That it was really hard to get people to kind of really understand these issues. And I think we've made a lot of progress in the last decade.
Yeah, I mean, I think, for people who live in America, it's worth them realizing what's happened in Europe. I mean, Europe, nearly 70 years ago, the whole of Europe abolished the death penalty. There'd been one or two people executed who were later found to be innocent, and they just felt it was beneath them as a civilization to still execute people. We have not seen in those 70 years a massive increase in crime. In fact, I would say we've seen a considerable decrease in crime. We've not seen an increase in people being killed unnecessarily or killed out of malice. And we can all sleep well at nights knowing that nobody is going to be wrongfully executed. I remember I think maybe 10 years ago being with you in New York, where you brought together 150 people who'd been acquitted, all of whom could have been executed by now. Delightful people. I mean, it was lovely getting out and meeting these people. And it just seems obvious that America should hurry up and get rid of it. It'll save. And I mean, it's horrible talking like this, but for some Americans, I think that it does matter. It will save Americans a lot of money, because it costs a lot of money to go through the whole process of having somebody executed, and a lot more than keeping them in prison. But maybe you could elaborate a bit more on that.
Sure. But I think you're absolutely right to kind of point out what the rest of the world, the democratic world, has done on this issue. And the European model is a really compelling one. I remember going to Russia some 20 years ago at the invitation of the Council of Europe, because Russia wanted admission to the Council, and one of their requirements was that you had to be a state that did not have the death penalty. And even the Russian government was willing to put aside capital punishment because they recognized the cost of holding on to this barbaric form of punishment. And I do think what other countries have done is instructive. I remember being in Germany many years ago, giving a lecture about the death penalty, and having German scholars stand up after the end of that and say, well, of course, we could never, ever again have a death penalty in this country. Given our history, it would be unconscionable for us to construct spaces where we are going to systematically kill people in the so-called name of advancing justice. And I thought about that. And I thought about what it would feel like to live in a world where the German state was once again executing people, putting people in gas chambers. And then I thought about what it would feel like if they were disproportionately Jewish. And I could not be silent in a world like that. And when I got back to the US, to land in Alabama, this state with this long history of enslavement and lynching and terrorism and violence and racial oppression and bigotry, and then to go to death row where 84% of the people who've been executed are Black. It just speaks to how isolated we've been in this country with regard to understanding these issues. And it does compromise our standing and our capacity to be a world leader on issues like human rights. And you're absolutely right when you think about the plight of people who are innocent. We now have established that for every 9 people we've executed in America, we've identified one innocent person on death row who's been exonerated and released. And you met some of those people at that event. And it's a really shocking rate of error. And I often argue that if someone told you that 1 out of 9 apples in a grocery store, if you touch it, you'll die, nobody would sell apples. Nobody would buy apples. We would retreat entirely from the consumption of that fruit. And at least there are some health benefits to eating an apple. Here we are now with the death penalty, though, and we haven't made that same response. And it does force us to make arguments that we shouldn't have to make about things like cost. And I mean, the prison system in this country, we've gone from $6 billion in spending on jails and prisons in 1980 in America to over $87 billion in spending last year. States are actually bankrupting their ability to provide health and human services and take care of the elderly and the vulnerable because of this investment in over-incarceration, the death penalty being at the top of that chain. And so not only can we save lives, not only can we add to the moral integrity of the community, not only can we commit in a more meaningful way to the cause of human rights, but we can also save money that will allow us to be more effective at improving public safety and providing services to people. So there's just all of these reasons pushing, a nation like ours to the result. And that's what's so encouraging about Virginia, to kind of now wake up to these realities. And I'm hoping that awakening continues to spread in state after state.
Yeah, I mean, by and large, I think lynchings don't happen anymore in America, or hopefully happen incredibly rarely in America. There are people who've been on death row who I've been lucky enough to get to know, who were effectively lynched by white police officers who just decided to charge them for a crime that they didn't commit, and actually told them to their face, you fit the profile. We don't mind whether you did it or not. You fit the profile. I.e., you were black, and in countries, the other countries that still have the death penalty, Saudi Arabia, North Korea, Iran. It is just too awful that America is still, listed amongst, those few remaining countries in the world that still have the death penalty, and often have the death penalty for all the wrong reasons, to get rid of people they disagree with, or people they dislike, or people are not like them, and so on.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point too, Richard, because one of the challenges that we have in America is we've never really reckoned with our historical failures. We talk a lot about our success, we talk a lot about our achievement, but we don't talk about our failures. And so we've really never reckoned with slavery. And one of the reasons why our death penalty system is so compromised by racial bias is because we haven't acknowledged the legacy of that. I think the great evil of American slavery wasn't involuntary servitude, it wasn't forced labor. It was the ideology we created to justify enslavement. Enslavers wanted to feel moral and just and Christian, so they created this narrative that Black people aren't as good as white people, that Black people are less human, less evolved, less capable, less deserving. And that ideology of white supremacy was the true evil of American slavery. And we fought the Civil War here, and the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war because that idea persisted. We never, in our amendment to end slavery, it talks about ending involuntary servitude and forced labor, but says nothing about ending this ideology of white supremacy. And because of that, I don't think slavery really ended here. I just think it evolved. And lynching and terror and traumatizing Black communities for a century became a manifestation of that bigotry. And Black people were pulled out of their homes and tortured and burned and killed, sometimes on the courthouse lawn, by mobs. And our courts did nothing, and our elected officials did nothing. And then as we got into World War II and on the other side of the World War II and became more global in our presence, other countries were looking at this spectacle of violence saying that has to stop. But rather than committing to correcting the problems of white supremacy and bigotry, we just moved these lynchings from outside to inside. We created courtrooms that acted in the same unreliable, expedited way, that had the same racialized features. And that gave birth to the modern death penalty. And that is why you've met condemned prisoners who can tell you about being profiled and presumed guilty and targeted and menaced because of their race and their color. And I just think this is a moment when we're going to have to commit to truth-telling about our history. In South Africa, after apartheid, there was a commitment to truth and reconciliation. They realized they couldn't go forward without some truth-telling. What is interesting to me about a country like Germany is you go to Berlin, You can't go 200 meters in Berlin without seeing markers and stones that have been placed next to the homes of Jewish families. There's a Holocaust memorial in the center of that city, and cab drivers and police officers encourage you to go to the Holocaust memorial. There are no Adolf Hitler statues in Germany. It'd be unconscionable for someone to argue that the defenders and the perpetrators of the Holocaust should be romanticized and celebrated. But I live in a country where the landscape is littered with the iconography of the Confederacy, where we celebrate the perpetrators of enslavement, the defenders of enslavement. Segregationists are honored and esteemed. And that consciousness is what shields us from dealing with the brutality of racial bias and the death penalty. But it is also what contaminates our environment, which is why we see police violence, which is why so many millions of people were on the streets this past summer. And it is our time now to reckon, to commit to truth and justice, truth and repair, truth and restoration. And I think these things are sequential. I think you have to tell the truth before you get to reconciliation, before you get to restoration. And for me, it's urgent. And what I keep saying to people is that I don't want to talk about slavery and lynching and segregation and the death penalty because I want to punish America. I want to liberate us. I genuinely believe that there is something better waiting for us, something that feels more like equality, feels more like justice, feels more like the healthy community and society that many of us seek. It is a place where there is no death penalty. It is a place where we do not tolerate racial violence and bigotry and discrimination. It is a place where we fundamentally reject lynching and its progeny. And that's part of what I think is so critical about the moment we're in.
In President Trump's final 4 weeks in office, he pardoned a lot of people, but he also imposed a nearly sort of unprecedented string of federal executions that that literally turned into a sort of killing spree. I mean, how did you feel to witness this? Were any of your people that you were representing executed?
I mean, I think it was horrific. I mean, it was a grotesque display of gratuitous power to kill. And frankly, most of those pardons were actually given to people who were affluent and politically connected. And so I think if we could, turn back the clock, to the spring of 2020 and just disempower the president from exercising any authority with regard to the justice system, that would have been better than what we've seen. It was tragic to see so many people executed in a short period of time. And it was done for political purposes. This was done to make a statement, to kind of flex some muscle, which is the most obscene form of abusing power that you can imagine. Half a dozen Black people were executed during that spree, many of whom had very serious arguments about the unfairness of their trial. There were people who had very serious arguments about the unreliability of their conviction. There was a woman, Lisa Montgomery, who had been so tragically victimized before her arrest that merited a lot more consideration. And the other thing that the Trump administration did, which I think was just added insult to injury, is that because they were worried about whether they could get the drugs necessary to carry out these executions through lethal injection, they actually began expanding new methods of execution. They legitimated executing people by firing squad and executing people by gas chamber. So in the waning days of the Trump administration, the United States government actually gave sanction to a policy of killing that was used by the Nazis during the early part of the 20th century to exterminate millions of Jewish people. That's the legacy of that administration with regard to these tragic killings. And I'm hopeful that the new administration and the United States Congress now realizes the urgency of abolishing the federal death penalty. I mean, the federal death penalty is a small part of the death penalty overall, but it's an important part symbolically and politically. And I'm really hoping that we can make progress with the Congress on that issue this year.
Hasn't Biden said that he will abolish it?
He has, and I think it's just getting the political forces aligned in a way that we can actually get that. I'm pretty confident that we won't see, there'll be a moratorium, something like we have in California, but I think we need to take that next step because there may be politicians that come along that try to abuse the system in the way that we saw President Trump abusing.
I'm going to ask you another question from a member of Literati. I've just got the surname, Kundera. Anyway, what she or he wants to know is whether you have observed judges' attitudes change to help be part of the solution to the many problems you identify in your book. Obviously, you've raised the concerns about the Supreme Court, but other judges, how do you think their attitude has changed?
Yeah, I do think we've seen real progress. Even in the state of Alabama, where I work, for a long time, we had a horrific policy where judges could override jury verdicts of life and impose the death penalty. And in fact, about 25% of the people we sentenced to death here had life verdicts that were overridden by trial judges. And that has now been abolished. I get invited to speak to judges in judicial conferences now in ways that just never happened a decade ago. And I think a lot of courts and a lot of judges in particular are desperate to be free of all of the corruption and all of the distortion that is created when you have a system that authorizes killing other people. I mean, it is, and it should be seen as a heavy burden. And I think a lot of judges have become more vocal and acknowledging the problems with with this issue. I had the great privilege of doing something with Justice Ginsburg before she died, and she was so passionate and so insightful about the need for reform. So yes, I do think the judicial environment has improved. I will caution, however, that President Trump appointed a lot of judges to the federal bench during his tenure, and many, if not all of those judges, represent a very different view. They're very enthusiastic about the death penalty. And so we're going to have to see what happens in the coming years, whether this progress we've made with the judiciary continues to be maintained.
I remember you saying to me that I think at least 1 in 9 people who are sentenced to death are later proved to be innocent. And as far as the remaining 8, it could be 1 or 2 out of them as well. But let's just assume it's just 1 out of 9. And you pointed out to me that I was in the airline business, and would I find it acceptable if every 9th plane crashed? And would people still travel with us? And obviously the answer is no. But I think that was a powerful statement that you made.
Yeah. I think our capacity for tolerating error is is so low. And I look at this moment we've been in with the pandemic, and you've seen the whole world respond to the risk of infection in a way that I think is rooted in an awareness that we cannot allow ourselves to become unhealthy in that way. And it just does bother me that when we have dramatic evidence of the sort we have about the unreliability of the death penalty, that we continue to tolerate this risk. And part of it is because the people who have power, the people who make policy, don't think their risk is 1 out of 9. And that's in many ways true. I mean, we have a criminal justice system in the US that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. Wealth, not culpability, shapes outcomes. And that distorts the kind of the risk aversion calculus. But a just society has to be prepared to make these decisions based on the vulnerability of all. And that's why I continue to believe that your justice quotient, your commitment to fairness and equality and human rights can't be judged by how well you treat the powerful and the wealthy and the privileged. You're going to have to be judged by how you treat the poor, the accused, the vulnerable, the condemned. And in that context, tolerating this risk of error is really unconscionable. And I think there will come a time when the United States will be judged harshly for the way it was indifferent to the problem of wrongful convictions and wrongful executions and the unreliability that we see in our system.
Yeah, I mean, even when somebody is found to be innocent and let out of prison, I think in almost all cases in America, the state make them sign a document saying that it's out of the goodness of the heart of the state that they're being released. They can't sue the state. And I mean, is that so? Because that's definitely the case. The one or two people I've met.
Yeah, it varies from state to state. There are some cases where that has had to happen. There are a few states that actually tried to provide compensation, but in the overwhelming majority of states, even if you try to sue, you're not going to be successful because we have given immunity to our police and our prosecutors and our judges, and it becomes very hard then to obtain any sort of remedy. And I just think, again, it's just so unconscionable that we would wrongly convict and condemn, threaten to kill someone for 5, 10, 20, 30 years, and then acknowledge that we were wrong and made a mistake and not feel any obligation to remedy the hardship. You can't give somebody 30 years back, but you can try to provide compensation and support that they don't have to worry. And we don't do that in the United States. And I think that's just another symptom of the kind of blindness that has shaped our policy in this area. The United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. 6 million people on probation and parole, 70 million Americans with criminal arrest histories. And I just think you can't get to that space without being blinded by a kind of fear and anger, which I think we've seen emerge in this country. And the unwillingness to provide remedy and repair to people who've been wrongly convicted that we've acknowledged is another manifestation of that disorder.
To Kill a Mockingbird, I mean, I think Walter Macmillan, whose case it was in Just Mercy, came from Alabama. And I think Harper Lee, who wrote the book, was also from Alabama. I mean, what influence did that book have on you?
It's interesting. I'd read the book as a younger person, and I liked the book, but I actually was troubled by the way in which the lawyer was being celebrated, Atticus Finch, despite the fact that his client was found guilty for something he didn't do and then ultimately dies. I related to Tom Robinson in that story, and I felt like we were making a mistake by celebrating this kind of advocacy as the model because it didn't actually achieve justice. And so when I got involved in Walter Macmillan's case and went to Monroe County, Monroeville for the first time, it was stunning for me to see a community preoccupied with celebrating that story, with romanticizing that story. The streets are named after characters in the book. Everybody was saying, oh, go to the To Kill a Mockingbird Museum. And here I was working on a case involving a Black man who'd been wrongly convicted of killing a white woman. And there was total, at best, indifference to his plight, and then hostility toward me and anyone trying to assist him. So the disconnect was very powerful for me. And I think it's one of the reasons why we need to have a new relationship to stories like To Kill a Mockingbird. It's a beautiful book, very, very impressed with Harper Lee's writing. But the way we respond to that narrative has to shift. And that was part of what I was trying to emphasize when I represented Walter.
Yeah. I'm going to go to another question. This is from Bree Wright. Fascinating names. Anyway, who would like, Bree must be female. Is Bree a female name? I don't know. Anyway, she or he wants to know, what is your social life like? She or he says, I imagine it must be hard to build friendships and relationships when it seems the weight of the world is on your shoulders. Knowing you, I got a feeling that's not the case. But anyway, give it a
Well, I mean, it's funny. I'm definitely all in with my work, and it has defined my social life as well. But I don't see a disconnect. I mean, I have formed beautiful friendships with my clients and their families and the community of people who I serve. I mean, that has become my, my outlet for fulfillment. And, it may seem unusual to some people, but I get great joy, great affirmation, great encouragement by being a part of the lives of the people I serve. I represent a lot of kids sentenced to die in prison, and that's a population that reach out to you and want to hold on to you because they need that to kind of continue to find hope. And I feel honored to be able to provide that back. And so it may be an atypical social life, but I feel quite privileged to have a life of meaning and fulfillment, one that can be emotionally intense, but one that is very much centered in the lives of the people I serve, my clients, their families, the communities that we're trying to shine a light on who have been marginalized. Because I came from a community like that, it feels familial to step into these spaces and play the role that I play, and very fulfilling and very affirming.
Wonderful. Can we move the world to a world where rehabilitation, not just for capital punishment, but other crimes can be in the forefront of the criminal justice system? I remember when we first spoke back in 2012, we spoke about we wouldn't lock up our children. We would try to sort of help them when they did stupid things. And I've had situations at Virgin where people have made mistakes where they could have gone to prison for them. By forgiving them and giving them another chance, they've gone on to do great things at Virgin. When I was a teenager, I messed up with customs and excise and spent one night in prison. And if I suspect actually, if I hadn't had a mother who had a house that she could mortgage, I could have ended up in prison. And would we be talking today? Would Virgin have happened? Would we be employed 80,000 people? The second chances just seem so important. And that is almost a stupid question because I know what your answer will be. But anyway, over to you.
But it's an important question because I do think we have to find ways to persuade more people to understand how much better it is to think about restoration and reconciliation than to think about punishment and condemnation. And that's ultimately what we're talking about, is how do we heal? And I do believe it's possible to move a society in the direction that you and I are talking about. I think we need a healthcare frame. I mean, we had a generation of politicians in this country who said that people who are drug addicted and drug dependent are criminals, and we're going to use the criminal justice system to respond to that. Now, what we could have said is that people suffering from addiction and dependency have a health problem, and we need a healthcare response to that problem. And if we had embraced that, we wouldn't have the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We could have saved families and kept them together. We could have helped people get back to the productivity that you've seen with some of your employees at Virgin and that other people have experienced in other business settings. And that's better for everybody. And so I really do think that has to be something that we emphasize. We've got hundreds of thousands of people in our jails and prisons who are mentally ill, and we're not treating their illness and addressing their disability. We're punishing them for being mentally ill, for being disabled. And that's cruel, that's barbaric, that's not consistent with a just society. And if we provided treatment and care, not only can we help those individuals, but we can actually create larger environments where everybody is safer, where everybody is more comfortable. And that's the beauty of kind of restorative justice, of not being locked into one mistake and letting it define someone's existence. I think all of us want to get past the mistakes we make. We want others to allow us to move past this because we know that we're not just that bad comment we made. We're not just that bad decision, that bad mistake we made. But to kind of want that for ourselves means we have to be able to give it to other people. And collectively, we haven't done that at the policy level in many societies, but we have to. And the good news is that when we do that, we see healthier communities. We see better outcomes for everybody. That's the beauty, I think, of restorative justice and this idea of recovery rather than retribution and revenge.
Mm-hmm. So I just got two more questions. I know you've got a lot to do. I mean, do you have hope that in the next 10 years and belief that in the next 10 years that America would abolish the death penalty?
You know, I was a little more hopeful when the court wasn't kind of shifted the way it did, but notwithstanding that, I do have hope. I mean, we're on the brink. You know, I'm hoping that California will move from moratorium to abolition, and that would reduce the size of death row in America by almost 25%. And that just creates the kind of momentum. I think even in southern states now, we're seeing a different kind of conversation, which Virginia represents. I have to believe that if we're really going to reckon with our history, if we're going to commit to truth and justice in the way that I'm hoping we will over the next decade, that will include abolishing the death penalty. I just think when we wake up to the reality of what we do, we won't want it anymore. So I still have hope. I really, in my lifetime, would love to see the death penalty abolished entirely. And we're closer than we've been before, and that's exciting. So I'm going to continue to hold on to that.
All right, my final, most serious question. I mean, Just Mercy was an absolutely brilliant film, and I think it would have had a lot of impact on moving the needle towards abolition of the death penalty. But more important than that, how was it to be portrayed by the world's reigning sexiest man alive, Michael B. Jordan? I mean, you've got a lot to live up to now. I mean, you must go and look in the mirror every day and make sure that you look at least half as good as him.
That's right. Well, I mean, I tried to persuade myself that if he's the sexiest man alive, does that make me the sexiest lawyer alive? I'm not that confused. I'm not that confused. No, yeah. It's great to have Michael B. Step into this, not just because he's such an icon and so, so extraordinarily talented, but because he was really serious and committed to doing this right. There are, a lot of times when books become movies, they lose the integrity and you can end up with something that you're not happy with. But I was really happy with the film, and the entire cast was so committed, to doing it right. And the director, Destin Daniel Cretton, was really thoughtful and involved me a lot and sought my input. And Michael was so committed to doing everything right. There was a moment when I said to him, he kept, he's like, well, how do you do this? And how do you move? And he was trying to be so authentic. There was a moment when I said to him, I really appreciate that. I'm honored that you want to be that authentic. I said, but you don't have to give away the Black Panther body when you play me. That's an area that would actually be okay. And no, he was great to work with, and having him playing me during that time period did mean that I tried to stay away from the Doritos a little bit more than I might have otherwise. Sweet tea is my vice here in Alabama, and it still is. But no, it was a real honor to have him play me. Well,
it's been a real honor for you to be chatting again. It's so wonderful that you're a young man, so that you can do so much more with your life, and obviously any way we can help, so that in 10 years' time, when we have this conversation again, the death penalty will be a thing of the past. But anyway, well, congratulations and thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Richard. It's always great to be in conversation with you.
Thank you. Cheers.
Take care.